Good afternoon. Welcome to the third episode of the Historic Preservationist. Today we're in historic Woodbury, New Jersey at the Gloucester County Historical Society, and we have a great crowd. Thanks everyone for coming. Today we're going to focus on an iconic piece by William Savory. William Savory was, some put him as the second or third leading furniture maker of the 18th century in Philadelphia. And remember, the finest furniture, in my opinion, as a furniture scholar, came out of the Philadelphia area. Some could quiver with that about Newport or Boston, but for pure straight linear design and proportion, Queen Anne and Chippendale, it doesn't get any better. We just want to talk a little bit about this. Moving into the 18th century, this is a Chippendale style, an American Chippendale style, not to be confused with its counterpart, a George III style, which is obviously coming from London. But this style, coming out of the Queen Anne period, which had a lot of curvatures, had a lot of ornamentation, this is downplayed in the ornamentation. The focus is on proportion and line. Not only line, but the pieces got bigger, but not too big. They got wider, deeper, higher. So Savory gives a massive feel here to his case pieces. We're going to talk a little bit about Patina. This piece has been redone probably in the turn of the century, the 1920s. That finish is going under crazing, a lot of oxidation. So when one rubs their hand across it, you can feel what's happening is the ambient air has dried out and the sunlight or whatever ambient light in the room has dried out the surface. And once that surface of that clear finish cracks, moisture, the sunlight, UV light goes in and starts relieving the finish from the actual wood. So the finish sitting on the wood, this clear finish is like a locking key. And what's happening, it's being cleaved or relieved, causing a checking or an alligator, so you can feel that on the surface. But just a word about patina. Patina is something that happens over, what, it's been 120 years, maybe 100 years, this piece has been refinished. So patina is environmental dust. It's whatever contaminants human beings have brought in here. If you have forced air heat, if there's any oil in the heat ducts, fumes, it lands on this. If this piece was in the 18th century near a large fireplace, it would be much darker. So when you look at American pieces such as this piece, you say, well, why is it so dark? We're talking about a piece here in Walnut. It's because of environmental factors. And we have different philosophies in the restoration and conservation going back either to number one, France, which is the leading indicator, the most knowledgeable people in furniture makers and conservators, they come from France. Second would be Britain, and America is way down here. And let's explain each of the three. So when we're talking about a French piece, if this were a French Louis XIV, what they would do is they would strip back, cut back all of the finish on this piece. Go down to bare wood, and because the UV light has actually bleached this piece out to an extent, when we get the finish, the color we're looking at is really what the finish has done on the surface. So the finish is getting dark. Really, this walnut is much lighter. So if we were talking about a French piece, the French would actually do some scraping and sanding and abrading to get into the wood. So the French in a restoration want the piece to look like it did the day the cabinet maker made it in his shop. Conversely, the English, which is the approach that I normally take in conservation restoration, approved more by Winterthur and some of the other major institutions in the country, is to cut back the finish just above the surface. We don't want to touch the surface of the wood. There is an inherent amount of patina in the subsurface of the wood, and then 80% of them is sitting on top. So we cut the finish off with all the environmental factors, and we rebuild a finish. And this finish is shellac. Shellac was a finish used for the middle of the 18th century. And shellac is from the lac bug. It only comes from India, and it's like a cocoon that the bug makes on a certain kind of bush down there. And we have the natives go down, they cut the twigs and branches off, break this cocoon, or it's actually the bug's house that it lives in. Excrement, dead bodies, everything is in there, and it goes through cleaning process for the last 250 years to form shellac. How they came up with this, who knows? But the French did this somewhere in the mid-18th century, and they found out that, that alcohol was the solvent to dilute this and to be able to apply the product. So probably the French were drinking wine, and this is serious, and that's why a lot of the French furniture is really burgundy base. So maybe they had a lot of burgundy wine. They said, well, put some wine in this stuff. Oh, we mix it up. It dissolves, put a brush and goes on. Well, it smooths out really nice. So theoretically, that's the possibilities how shellac came to be, okay? And at times you run into situations where, not this one, but there's a couple other pieces in the collection here at the Society, that somebody's come over with oil-based varnish. Somewhere in the 1820s it was developed, and 1820s to 1900 this varnish was put over the shellac. So they're a perfect marriage. Everybody's happy for the first 5-6 years, then you hate each other for the balance of your marriage. That's what happens. So the finish, it looks beautiful on there. The novice can put it on, it flows, it's shiny, it looks beautiful. The homeowner could do it. But what happens after 10, 15, 20 years is the varnish, the oil starts to dry out and it starts to crack and alligator. So there are other issues that some of the pieces here in the museum, but we're not going to relate them today. So we're back to the British. When the British are restoring a piece, they're cutting the film finish off back to the surface of the wood. So they're leaving a good part of the color in, the character in, which is good. And again, that's the premise we're taking. The American way, unfortunately, the Americans like to leave it dirty. They like to take this and put a little more smuts and colors and pigments on it. And why I say that, I've been doing this for 37 years. And you know, I'm around antique dealers. I see a lot of nefarious things happen. And when you see pieces come on TV shows that they're talking about this kind of a piece, it's very dark and they say, oh, the old patina is on there. No, that's not true, because this is oxidizing. In another 20 years, there'll be no finish on this piece. It's on its way to ruin. It's like putting snow on a 10-degree day out in the yard. The snow will still evaporate, even though it's not above temperature. So the oxidation process, this finish will actually leave. So what it does, the American way of restoration, so-called restoration, is to smuts it up better. So we can do some fake things. We could put some carving up here, put some more smuts, it matches the smuts down here, and everybody's happy. And we can put it to auction, we can put it on the local Brandywine Antique Show, whatever the case may be, and say, wow, this is a one of a kind. This guy made 12 like this, but this has the carving on the top. And so the antique dealer is trying to say, well, this was made for General Cadwalder or something like this. So we're being facetious here, but that's true, and that's how they overcome people, and that's the fakery in the antique world, unfortunately. So the proposal for this piece is to cut back the finish, because the finish is failing. The finish is meant to do two things: to protect the wood and enhance the wood. The most important thing is to protect the wood surface. So particularly in the heating system that we have here, air conditioning, is that the heat and ambient moisture goes in and out. We need to slow that down. So we're trying to shut down all the pores on the wood as much as possible to make this transition from heating to cooling slower. Because if the wood is going up and down daily basis or weekly basis on extremes, it's very damaging to the wood. And as we'll later take a look, you can see on both sides of the piece it's severely cracked. So this begs the question, like in Savory's workshop, he had a shop on Pine Street. How was this piece made? Pine Street, South Street, Walnut Street, these streets was a plethora of cabinet making, or we call them furniture making shops in Philadelphia in the 18th century, starting in 1710 and really hitting the high stride somewhere around the third quarter of the 18th century when this was made in the 1750s, 1760s. These shops would only be about 15 by 15 feet square, total utilitarian shops. Lucky if they had one window in the front, dirt floors, no electricity, no heating. Somebody would have to have a very small fireplace or even a wood stove, a Franklin-style stove at that point. So conditions are poor, and this guy is sitting on a dirt floor as it's being built and things of that nature. So, but we have to realize that, just say on Pine Street, there at one time there was 50 small shops. First you'd have your joiner. You'd have heavy, thick timbers. His place probably would be 30 or 40 by 15 feet. And you would have had hand planers, primarily apprentices, going through 5, 6, 7-year apprentice programs, literally hand planing huge planks that would have been the sides, the lid or flap as they call it, and the panels and the sides here. So that would start there. The designer would form a contract with maybe 10 different artisans down the row with the joiner. So the designer pays the joiner. The pieces are carried over into the next studio. They're cut up, they're planked, and the carcass is built. The sides of this piece are built. The framing is built. The sides of the top, the door. All these pieces are cut up. That was the second process. It's taken from that, they're paid, it goes into the next. So you would see all these carts rolling down these streets in Philadelphia just for the furniture industry alone. Quite magnificent. But I mean, how did they do it? It had to be more from tradition, more it had to be in love, not just working with wood. These weren't woodworkers. And you have to think, like, where did these designs come from? I mean, they're living in these very bucolic surroundings. One window, dirt floor, no electricity. I mean, who wants to work in that condition? But yet they could turn out masterpieces like this and many of the others that we've been looking at. You know, we have a high chest on stand here from the pre-1700s. So it's the same thing, the chest behind me. Where did they produce these things? It's pretty amazing. So. Let's talk about the beginning of how this piece came to be. Okay, so William Savory, we have a signature on the back of S. It is assumed this was from the family of Elizabeth Haddon that started Haddonfield. And there's an S on the back, which is very reminiscent of many, many pieces for Savory. It's just very low-key, mundane. You find very few labels until you hit about the 1780s, 1790s. At the end of Savory's career, did he put a nice label on there, say something like made exclusively for the affluent and knowledgeable or something like that. And that would be a typical Savory label, but we don't have one here. But in the earlier pieces, 1750, 1760, you may just have an S or sign Savory, or maybe that was the apprentice that did that. It was not a big deal back then, because I don't know how long they thought these pieces would ever last in the history of the world. I mean, if Savory knew today, we'd be standing here talking about this, it'd be magnificent. I mean, and if these objects are maintained, someone will be standing here 300 years from now talking about, maybe they'll have a video clip of today. So, and the unfortunate thing in all this is when we start building on false information. So, you know, we try to be as accurate as we can. I mean, I form an investigative role to go inside pieces and determine age authentication. So that's the key. And it's not just bringing the local guy down the street to come in and fix it and fix the finish. So a lot of things gets masked over, bad repairs. So with what I do, the majority of what I do is probably, well, 30, 40% is undoing the bad repairs first and then doing the restoration and conservation. So it's always bad repairs, untrained repairs. And what we never want to do is to make a repair and it to come back and haunt us 10, 15, 20 years from now. So it looks absolutely gorgeous, everything blends in, you know, we fixed that hole in the door, and then 15 years from now, it looks pink. One morning they come in here, it looks pink. It's because like materials were not used, or sustainable materials were not used. So that's very important for the conservator and the restorer. So we go back to 1750. In 1750, in this country, we're in the beginnings. Who comes? Furniture is a chest behind me. This style of chest. It's a joiner's chest. It's generally out of oak. A lot of these chests did not have carving. This one does. But these chests were very basic. So why did they have this chest? They were traveling from England, from Ireland, from Scotland, even from France. So that's how this chest made its way here. So this chest was to carry all the belongings of that entire family possibly here. So when they arrived here, 1650, this is what they had as a piece of furniture. So what did they do with this? They sat on it. They sat on the floor. They ate on it. This was their table. They put their possessions in here. This was everything. There was no such thing as a bed back then. They slept on the floor. They make a mattress out of corn cob husk, things like that, and a burlap type blanket to sleep on the floor. That's how crude at this point things were. So in regards to this, what happened was, the next segment from this was a chest of drawers. So if you can imagine this secretary, forget the top, forget the slant. This would have been a chest of drawers and down. All these drawers. And this, just imagine, was a flat top on here. So we go from the chest, the dower type, blanket type chest as we think it, into a commode or chest of drawers. Okay, so we take that, we put drawers in it. So we got some organization going on now. We just don't have one big space to dump stuff in. We got organization. And after that, you're looking at probably the 1720s. Then they come up with a slant front desk like this. They raise it up another 16 inches, and it started out with another drawer that would pull out, and you would have your whole desk interior there. But by the 1720s, then they open this up, and they put the slant lid or flap on. So then you have an interior. Back in these early ones, 1720, 1725, 30, it was just flat drawers. Some were open. Some just had pigeonholes, just openings. But again, as we got up into the Chippendale era, this, again, the highlight of opulence so who was pushing this? The elite were pushing it. They wanted to show off their wealth more and more. Particularly 4 or 5 families in Philadelphia, and I was doing a talk yesterday, and we're talking about Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin started the Free Library Company of Philadelphia through the Junto Club. And the issue was there was 5 people in Philadelphia at that time in the 1760s that had massive libraries. They wouldn't lend a book to anybody because knowledge is power, so they weren't going to divvy out any books. They wanted to control everybody in Philadelphia at that time. So hence Franklin started the library to disperse the knowledge and the power base. But anyway, so what we're getting at here, so we built a superstructure. By this time in the Chippendale era, we start adding ornamentation now, not just the cubby holes, okay? But somewhere around 1750, it became very popular not to have a separate bookcase across the room. This was all-inclusive. This was the computer center. This was the center that you ran your business by in the 18th century, right into the end of the 19th century. Everything was put on here. The unfortunate thing today is these guys aren't too popular because they can't hold the latest laptop, the latest PC. I'm talking about with the younger folks, you know. So, I mean, we're all around 40 in here, but those real young folks, they're not too popular. So these desks have lost a lot of their value. Not a Savory desk like this, but a lot of the English slant front desk and a lot of the American counterparts that are as important as this. So how sad is that? But I mean, I think I could accommodate a laptop on here if I had those in my books, and I have plenty of room for a small library of books. I could have my big library somewhere else. But anyway, that's not in the agenda for today. So in the 1750s, it was very common to put a box or library for books on top, and it's actually fitted in a molding here, so it's not going to slide around, it's not going to slide or fall off. And you had options. So Savory's client probably says, "Oh, you have some options here. What do you want to do? Do you want glass doors? Do you want one pane of glass?" We can put a pane of glass on each side, and we can put curtains. We can put 2 curtain rods and slide them back. We want to see our books. We can slide the curtain back on each rod when we don't want our books to fade. We can make classic window designs, muttons and mullions. We can make arched panels or arch windows, or we can make a raised panel. This is an inset panel. So there are all kind of options, and the interior designer from the start would choose that. So we've had interior designers from around 1700, whether it be in the major centers in Philadelphia or London or Paris, and they were dictating the stylistic changes. So what we have here is we have our doors, and you can see now they're talking about choosing lumber. We have walnut wood. This whole piece was made out of one tree. Traditionally, it would start with one tree. So the interior designer, or sometimes the client would be involved in this. They pick the tree. They go out and they find the tree. And the joiner shop would plank this up with a pit saw, and then they would start cutting the major dimensions of wood up. And this is the crotch right here. And this is the major, maybe 20 or 30 feet up, depending on the walnut tree, about 20 feet up. The tree has the first 2 splits. So that first split is a crotch, as we think a crotch right there. And where that splits, there's a lot of crazy, beautiful grain, and that's it right here. So this is sawed out, and it's book matched. It's meant to open up to mimic each other. But right now, because of patina, because of dirt, oxidation and finish, we can't see this beautiful crotch that's going up here. And it was meant to be seen. It was not meant to be hidden like this. So let's take a look, open this up. So we had an option of glass doors or mirror doors, better yet, because if you were in a really dank room, you may say, well, you know, there's only one window in here. We can't afford windows. It's the 18th century. So let's put mirrors in here. So here you have your candle slides. You put your candle sconce here with your candle. This one's stuck. We're not going to force it. You put your candles. So you have your lighting here, and you have the mirrors that can reflect it back into the room if you have a darker room. And we're going to make a note here about this. This is a William Savory trademark. This candle slide is made like a breadboard end. And maybe after a while we can come up and take a look at it. But this is dovetailed. So this piece comes across this way. The other grain is meeting this way, and they're dovetailed, 3 beautiful dovetails. Savory's the only cabinet maker of the 18th century Philadelphia that I saw do this, or anywhere, London or Paris. So then inside, do we have adjustable shelves? Do we have a fitted interior? But this one we don't. We have a stationary interior. So predetermined shelves, beautiful. Predetermined shelves, we can't change these. A lot of these had a saw ratcheted type system where we could move a piece of wood on both sides and move the shelves up and down. For whatever reason, whoever commissioned this piece knew what they wanted to put up there, and that's how they wanted it done. An option in the 18th century is the kind of back you wanted. Typically, the wood in this piece, secondary wood, is poplar. Typically, the back would be poplar, but because I feel this person wanted fixed shelves, he wanted this open all the time. So he's looking at the same walnut wood that the carcass has been made out of. So it lends itself very well, but keep in mind, this piece was much lighter when it was made. It's darkened, again, because of the finish. So again, we have a fixed interior, and we have a very typical Chippendale molding, and the moldings were done with hand planes. You would have gone to the hand planing shop, you would have had a long workbench, a piece of wood, and somebody would have held a hand plane and literally walked 8 feet down, back and forth, until they made that molded piece, and then it would be mitered and applied. And we can see here the hardware, so we'll go back to the hardware. The hardware was made locally, so yes, you'd have 2 or 3 blacksmith shops in Philadelphia of different qualities. And this is a medium quality. It's not the cheapest and it's not the best. And it would obviously depend on the clientele and what they wanted. So again, options galore in this. And I don't think we even ponder that in the 18th century or the late 17th century to have options of building the piece of furniture. I mean, life was difficult enough. You had to eat and you had to have jobs and you had to swindle some people or whatever you had to do to survive, and that was it. So, and we're worried about the kind of hardware we're going to put on this, but I mean, these are well-to-do people, so yes, I think they could do that. So we're interdispersing here with condition. So we're looking at some condition issues here. These issues are where the finish is really breaking down. These are, this is use abuse. People are really hitting this and checking, and so when it gets dinged and nicked like this, the finish really starts to undermine underneath. But there's one thing that Queen Anne left. Queen Anne left a lot of frilly, probably it could be a gooseneck top on this, it could be an arch top, but we're in the Chippendale style, so we're in a very boxy but well-proportioned style, well-usable style. So we're going to talk about the marriage of the style of the carcass with the style of the ornament. Rococo was a style of leaves, vinage, all natural flowing ornament. And that's where the fans emanate from. So these are your quote secret drawers. They're not that secret. But these carved shells or fans, pending, if you were in New England, they'd be more called a fan. Newport, they're going to be called a shell. Here in Philadelphia, we're going to call them a shell. Okay, shells came in many shapes and sizes, but this is the Rococo element, the marriage of Rococo and Chippendale here. Okay, but it's leaving all the good stuff on the inside. So again, this was meant more often than not for the flap or the lid to be down like this to impress your friends or your clients, whatever way this piece was being utilized in the house or the place of business. So we have these various fans going down, and to take a look, these are some absolutely gorgeous, very, very tiny dovetails in walnut, half-blind dovetails, all hand-cut, and you can take a look inside to make sure they're hand-cut. You can actually see the saw marks. So as the individual's cutting this way, each of these dovetails, he's actually cutting a saw mark, a kerf mark into the back of the drawer front. And typically a piece like this was going to be used to hide valuables. Now I'm sure after the word got out, if you're a top grade thief, then you eventually find out where all the secret compartments. Me, a builder of furniture in the 90s, that was the real hot item. Someone would say, well, incorporate 6 secret compartments and 12, whatever the case may be. So this is called your prospect area. And if we can get this open. So we have a door and we have 3 drawers inside. And again, these will be called secret drawers, but these are your prospect drawers in the prospect. And this segment actually can pull out. But the interesting thing is here, these guys, we've suffered some damage here. These are called document drawers or just fluted pilasters. They have flutes. They're missing the capitals, and we're going to have to recreate those in a restoration. But there's a wire here. So when you push in, you relieve the document drawer. So not only is it relieves itself as just an architectural detail, it's actually a drawer. But when it was in, it was so tight, you could not tell it's a drawer. So you put cash in here, you know, wills and deeds and things of that nature. So there's two of them. There's one flanking the other side. And it's relieved by putting a wire in a small hole and pushing this wooden spring in, okay? And these are called Quaker locks, and where I have my other studio up in Pennsylvania, they're called Dutch locks. If you're in New England, they're called Puritan locks, so I guess wherever you are. Yeah, so, but anyway, it's just a matter of taking the side with a chisel, putting an incline in, and gluing a piece of timber that acts as a lock, and then hence the wire pushes in, and you pull out, and there's your hidden document drawer. So, a very nifty element, but you know, unfortunately, we have one capital here on this side, I believe, at the bottom. So that's what we're going to go by to make the other three missing capitals. Yeah, yeah. And typically you would find on the interiors of these, you find less wear, so the piece comes up looking a little bit better. And actually what the piece looked like, but you can tell that this piece has spent a lot of its life, probably prior to being here in the museum, that it was open. So the patina kind of emulates over the entire piece. But so we have to think about a plan of intervention for this. So we have a couple issues happening over here. And typically you would have had a Chippendale chair, such as this, you know, sitting sideways. So this would have been called a loper drawer, or sometimes the loper was just a 1-inch piece of material, timber that comes out that it would rest. But so you have, you know, double material. You can put candles. So these were used for candles for the sconces. But this guy has suffered. It looks like it's probably in transportation or operator error. Somebody has really destroyed this drawer front, and hence it has to be repaired. So that's one of the first things. That's a rather large issue there. We already talked about the capitals on the inside. The major things, and if everybody can see on both sides, we have a couple cracks here. And these are structural issues. So just before we got started, you know, I was doing some pushing on it. The piece goes back and forth, and that's all part and parcel to the structure, what's happened to this piece on the side. So is it common? These are one-piece sides. These are 27 inches deep. One plank, 27 inches deep. Pending where they put the center of the tree, the sap, is where these cracked. It'd be difficult to saw a tree much thicker than that back in the 18th century. Two men in a pit saw. One guy's in the ground, the other one's pulling the saw up like this. So you're talking about maximum cut here. This could have been used for a pie crust table, a side of the desk. But so that is a structural issue that concerns me the most for the viability of keeping this piece for the long term. So we have the sides issues, we have a loper issue, and then basically a cutback of the finish. We need to cut back this finish, and we want to see a little bit of this crotch, but we don't want this to go down the road to finish failure, and that's where we don't want to be, because once that happens and the ambient moisture gets into the wood, sometimes the flap will tend to warp. It goes back and forth. Drawers don't fit anymore, but surprisingly enough, because the finish we have on here, all these drawers work rather seamlessly for what it is. And you can see some other things that have been happening to this. So somebody has tried cleaning. They've tried cleaning the brasses, and you can see these dark rings on it. Again, if you're in the American antique market, they're going to say, oh, look, there's age. It's old stuff, right? Well, it's not good old stuff, because what they've used is actually going down and staining the wood. It's deteriorating the wood right through the finish. So not a good thing. So taking the British standpoint of conservation and restoration, we're going to pull those off, and we're going to get rid of this degraded material, whatever it may have been at the time. There may have been a lot of chlorine in there. Chances are that's what it was. And then, you know, it's going to look rather uniform. So the other thing that are in excellent shape, but I want to show you this, are the feet. Let me move the chair. So we had almost here, we have disposable. This is a sign of the Chippendale era. This is called a Brackett feet. Brackett foot rather, a set of Brackett feet. And the OG is that Sima curve and a reverse Sima curve. And it's a little quite different than the Queen Anne. So this is a good indicator of authentication. I mean, it's just a general one, but it's good, and it holds true in this case. But these pads at the bottom were added to the feet, and they were replaceable because this piece was on a lot of moisture at times, a lot of wet wood, and sometimes dirt floors or brick floors. Houses had brick floors back then. So these pieces, when they started to rot, could be popped off and new ones could be put back on. So what a great feature. It's like reshoeing a horse, something like that. So it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I think that brings us up to speed. Would anybody have any questions? Yes?
What would be the process of correcting the cracks on the side? What would you do?
Well,
squeeze it together?
No, it has spent so much time drying out now. We're going to have to fill that with something, determine structurally. Number one, there's a couple options of putting something in there, putting a shim, so to speak, or a filler piece of the same material, getting 18th century walnut and using that. And, or we may not actually fill that crack. We may say, okay, aesthetically, I'm not happy what's going to happen with that when we do that. We're going to leave it like this, but we're going to go inside and we'll put like a dovetail. So we'll inset a dovetail in the side of the carcass on both inside, maybe 3 up one side and 3 on the other. It will not move, but it's going to give it super strength. We're talking about making a dovetail piece this big and inlaying it about a 1/2 inch into both sides. And that's probably what I would do with this piece. Yeah, yeah. Anybody else have any questions?
What would the cost of this piece have been back when she bought it?
The cost of this piece in the 18th century probably would be around $200. Yeah, that's probably the equivalent to build a normal size house in that time period too. I mean, a small house, yes, about $200.
Would the fact that Elizabeth Haddon, as a Quaker, would that have dictated her choice of hardware so that it would not have been more ornate?
Well, I think as a Quaker, Elizabeth Haddon, this hardware is a bit too upscale. So I'm sure when we pull this off, we're going to find other holes. This is a high style piece. Well, this is hardware put on probably in the 1780s. So these are backplates from the 1780s. So I'm sure this is an upscale because this was not Quaker hardware that I'm accustomed to seeing. But in the same token, that's a wonderful point that this piece is extremely simplistic. So we're looking at the inset panels as opposed to the raised panels. So most Quakers, the furniture that I see in inventories have the inset, not the raised. It's too gaudy or it's too presumptuous. Nor do they have the arched doors at the top. So there's this little feature, just enough to tantalize the eye and take this piece out of visual boredom. I think that's what I would go with that, yeah. Anybody else with a question? Well, thanks everyone for coming, and we're going to continue on with this series. We're going to do a contrast and comparison for the show of 2 more secretaries. We're going to do one with a mirror door and one with pane doors, muttons and mullions. They're going to be English pieces, but we're going to contrast with this piece as we go. And during the restoration process of this, we'll probably be putting some small video clips out on Instagram. So if anybody's not on Instagram, maybe you want to try and get on it. It's not the easiest thing to do. But thanks everyone for coming. I had a great time. Thank you. Hi, Gregg Perry here for the Historic Preservationist. This is continuing episode 3. Earlier today we were at the Gloucester County Historical Society and we were talking about period secretaries. There we were talking about a William Savory secretary from Philadelphia around the 3rd quarter of the 18th century. Today we're going to do a little contrast and comparison about an earlier piece, but also an English piece, but nevertheless the same walnut wood. But I was just sitting here enjoying a glass of Madeira, one of the favorite 18th century beverages of the elite and the aristocracy in Philadelphia, Franklin, Washington, Jefferson at the City Tavern. And tawny, not nonetheless, 10 years old, so very good beverage. And just doing a contrast and looking up our piece, which is in a major book here, which is very interesting. British Antique Furniture for anyone is interested, by John Andrews. So it's a great book for looking at period furniture. But so we're going to do a little contrast comparison here, and let's get started. Hi, Greg Perry here for the Historic Preservationist. Today we're at the Samuel Shivers House Museum in historic Woodstown, New Jersey, 1724. We're carrying on our episode 3, which was again back at the Gloucester County, New Jersey Historical Society. And we're going to contrast and compare a William Savory, 3rd quarter of the 18th century Walnut Secretary bookcase with this lovely George II, probably dating around 1700, 1710. From just on the outskirts of Lincolnshire, the UK. Okay, so what we're going to do is first let's just talk about the basic form. The form, it's a bit lower. People were shorter. The flap writing surface is about 2 to 3 inches lower than the Savory we looked at last week. The whole piece is just a bit more diminutive. It's a bit more basic, even though Savory was, they were operating in a Quaker world of really low-key ornamentation in the Philadelphia area at that time. But this is before ornamentation really took over. And this entire object is about wood, beautiful walnut wood. This is French walnut. Very few walnut trees were ever grown or growing in England. So they were all imported from France. But that became a real issue when there would be conflicts between France and England. And then eventually the French cut the walnut off, and it brought in the era of mahogany. So that was for another time. We'll talk about that. But what we have here on the front, the facade, from top to bottom, from upper molding all the way down to the feet, is burl walnut, and that can be interpreted as stump material or wart material. So when you see that big outgrowth, or it's actually a cancer on the side of a tree, that's called a burl, and that would be lopped off and then cut into very thin pieces of veneer, probably about 1/16 of an inch thick, to be applied to this. And when we talk about root material, is also on here in a veneer form. Just imagine digging the root up of a huge walnut tree. It could be 4 by 4, 10 by 10 feet, and then 2 men with a pit saw are going to go back and forth and saw off slivers of veneer to be utilized in this fashion. So what the cabinet maker of the period tried to do, the furniture maker, he tried to use the figure material as best he could and get the most mileage out of it, because it was costly and difficult to generate, to harvest, as we say today. So starting at the top, we have a typical molding across the top of Cove done with a molding plane, and it's been veneered. And how they would do that, you would just imagine a huge dowel rod you would put in there and clamp it once the veneer was applied with adhesive, and you'd pull that in to get good adherence to the wooden, the wooden concave. And this is a bead. This is a 3/4 inch bead. And let's talk about this. If we were running this in the shop today using a wood molding plane, or some craftsmen use routers, the grain would run lengthwise on the top to apply this. But what's going on here in the 18th century, they found better grain out of this walnut wood by doing small cross sections and butt gluing them together. So they were butt gluing them, plus they were gluing onto the top of this Cove molding. So it gives, today, on an antiquity basis, a scholarship basis, it's a way of authenticating pieces. So a lot of this occurred prior to 1710. After 1710, 1720, they started running the moldings full length. Okay, so it's a good authentication. So let's take a look at the doors. Door construction is traditional mortise and tenon on the inside, utilizing, again, the British brown oak, and it's been veneered with a walnut. So we have the walnut burr coming down here, but the whole perimeter of the inside of the mirror, it's almost like a liner, is with a cross-banded type walnut. And then the outside is a herringbone. It's wonderful. It's very difficult to see, but it's like we have 2 arrows going up here around the whole perimeter of both doors. So when this piece was new, it was just glowing. what's occurred today, it's acquired its patina since about 1700, it could be 1690, 1710. So this patina has muted everything together. So we're not looking and seeing all the details. And this is an unrestored piece. It's ready for restoration in a few weeks. But when it was new, you would have seen the different cuts of wood, whether it be the cross banding, the burr, or the herringbone bordering, just jump out. And it was all about to make these mirrors jump out. So as last week we were looking at the William Savory piece, the Secretary bookcase top, we saw it had panels, flat panels. Some have raised panels. But in very dank quarters, particularly around 1700, houses didn't have windows. It was very costly. Glass was in low production, particularly in cottages in England. Even in castles, you didn't have a lot of windows because you didn't want too many drafts. So what they would do is they need to lighten the room. So here's our illumination, the good old candle, okay? So the candle would be put here on the candle supports or candle slides, and you're going to get full reflection back. It provides an immense amount of light. It's amazing with 2 candles. So these candles were apt to burn about 4 hours each. Let's take a look at the top of the bookcase section. And, this is used for books. We have 3 shelves here. 3 adjustable shelves used for books, and they achieve this just by adhering 1/8-inch strips back, and these are fully removable. Pull it out, go into the next slot to get to your height of books. And down here we have a fitted row of pigeonholes with very nice cutout valances, and then we have drawers. And when looking at the English drawer, the typical English drawer of this period around 1700 is made out of, again, English brown oak as secondary wood, and the bottoms are put absolutely flush with the drawer sides, and the grain runs front to back. So it's a good indicator, authentication purposes, just around 1700. The drawer front is also made out of brown oak, and it is veneered, and again, cross-banded with just traditional plain black walnut, okay? Most of the hardware on this piece, from top to bottom, has been replaced. It's been upgraded to something around between the 2nd and 3rd quarter of the 18th century. Traditionally, these would have had cotter pin type pulls, and they would have had very petite back plates with engraving on them. So this will go back to a similar style of original style hardware with the restoration. And let's take a look at the inside of the doors. So this was really meant as a workpiece and probably used by a merchant or a mercantile individual. This was his center of commerce right here. He would have all his ledgers and all his billing information here, putting letters and things in the pigeonholes and whatnot. What we have here, so the doors, because of that, the doors would have been open a fair amount of the time. Probably locked at the end of the day to avoid theft if possible. But there's this beautiful plain walnut panel over the back of the mirror. As opposed to the Savory piece we looked at last week, it was totally unfinished on the inside. So no one really cared. But yet, the interesting thing, the Savory piece on the inside, the backboards were finished. They were actually a finished walnut as opposed to a secondary wood. So this is a secondary wood of, again, British brown oak. And we had someone ask us last week, what's going on with the mirrors? Are the mirrors dirty? Why don't you clean the mirrors here in the museum? The issue with the mirrors is they're actually pure silver from around 1700, and they're oxidizing. So the process, they would take the glass, this would have been hand-blown glass, and glass similar that was happening right down the road about 6.5 miles down in Alloways Town here in southern New Jersey in the 18th century. So they're hand-blowing the glass. They actually float a layer of silver on top, silver oxide, it dries, and then they put a backing of asphaltum over that. The asphaltum tends to hold the silver in, but after 300 years, what's happening is that the ambient air moisture is going through as the asphaltum is drying out, the oils are drying out, it's going through the asphaltum into the silver behind the glass, and it's causing an oxidation, causing this hazing. But this hazing, again, is a great indicator of authentication of period time. So anybody out there that has mirrors that are going this way, feel very fortunate. This is what the absolute scholars, connoisseurs, and collectors are looking for, okay? So we have that. We have our candle slides. This holds our illumination. And we look into the inside of the fitted material. Again, we have a cross-grain type molding here. The sides of these typical British pieces are very robust. Made out of, again, brown oak, a pure 1 inch here, where the counterparts in the States are out of solid wood and probably around 3/4. So here we have British construction on case sides, ribbing, etc. Superstructure in general about 1 inch, plus the veneer on the outside. So more of a robust piece. But generally these pieces that were veneered, these European continental pieces, weighed much less. The walnut piece up in the museum yesterday was very, very heavy. So again, door construction similar to what's inside. We have the valances and we have the flap, or lid as we call it in the States. And this is covered with actually burl walnut or stump walnut, and the outside is covered with the walnut of the wort of the tree. Let's take a look at this. We have cross banding. Cross banding, actually, it's the wide. It's actually 2-inch banding going around the perimeter of the flap or lid. In here we have walnut wood, burr walnut here. And then, again, that herringbone design is repeated here that we're seeing on the Secretary bookcase. So these are indicators that if anyone out there is interested in buying a period piece that's, quote, right, to look, we're picking the herringbone, these 2 arrowed pieces that are wrapping the perimeter of the upper doors, they're wrapping this. A lot of times when people are faking, it may be too difficult to say that to do this inlay. You see it here, but you don't see it up here. This tells me this piece is married together properly. It's not a bad marriage, but it's a good marriage. Okay, and let's take a look at the drawer fronts. The drawer fronts are the same way. We have the drawer fronts covered with a basic background of burr walnut, and then the perimeter of cross banding and the herringbone design on the inner ledge. But what was really going on here is the missing feet. So they should be a bun or ball type foot, as some call it. If it's a ball, it should be a squashed ball or squashed bun. And typical of dating around 1700. But typically what happens here is, number one, it could be wear. Maybe this was on a stone floor for a couple hundred years of its life, and all that ambient moisture coming out of the stones being sucked up into the balls, and we had deterioration of the feet, and they were replaced. They said, oh, I think maybe we'll replace it with something a little more current, end of the 18th century, early 20th or early 19th century. So they put just a molded base on instead of going through the trouble of putting that old style foot on, as they may have termed it then. And at times it was just an upgrade. You would have had designers coming into individuals' houses, you know, all through the 18th century and 19th century, and say, well, let's take that piece and let's change it a little bit. Let's upgrade it to a newer period style. And sometimes that's what's happened to the base. At other times, it's moving these pieces around because they're rather heavy. They're moved around in wagons for many times, you know, horse-drawn wagons early, up into 1850, and they get banged and the foot falls off. So instead of turning a new foot on a lathe, they put a whole new base molding. But overall, we have just a gem. And just to talk about the overall patina is right on this piece. As we looked at the piece, which in the museum the other day was actually refinished, and it's a typical American walnut, very dark. This is the patina that you're going to realize on an English piece of 250, 300 years. I call it, or the connoisseurs or scholars call it, toffee caramel. It's this warm, romantic feeling to the wood, and this is what draws people to this. It's not, again, the ornateness, any ornamentation that was added on the inside or the top, but it's the beauty of the natural wood. So wrapping up, I think we're about done with our contrast comparison of our British Continental Secretaries, composed to our William Savory from Philadelphia. I want to remind everyone to stop by next month for this upcoming issue of the Historic Preservationist. We're going to be visiting Alloway's Town, and we're going to be discovering the first glass making in America. A very bucolic town in southern New Jersey, the first place here where they made flat plate glass. And you know, that this type of glass could have been made here. This was made in England, obviously, and so we're going to explore that, and it's going to be a great journey of glass making in southern New Jersey. So please join us then, and thanks for stopping by to the Historic Preservationist.